And this afternoon, we are most fortunate to have Lucy from United Kingdom. And that's brilliant. And Monica will introduce Lucy. Monica, take us away.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Monica. I'm an addict and very grateful to be part of CA in recovery. It's what brought me my life. I'm very honored to introduce Lucy. Lucy and I go back a long time, 17 plus years. Back in the day, there were many countries in Europe where there was no CA, and there was no CA where Lucy lived. And we happened to be both members of an online meeting, and it was nothing like Zoom that didn't exist. It was email exchange. And she was asking for a sponsor, and I happened to be on the sponsor list because that is how we reached out to people in countries where there was no CA. And I started to get to know her. And I remember that she was working the steps, and there was another fellow, a friend of hers, who was also trying recovery, but she was involved with bad boyfriends and problems and jobs and bankruptcy, debt, whatever. And there was a moment when Lucy asked me, Monica, like that's how she speaks, Monica, why is it that there's no drama in my life? And I said, maybe because you are actually working the steps. And not just reading and attending a meeting when it's convenient, but you are working the steps because Lucy had a boyfriend trouble, whatever, in-law trouble, job trouble, whatever, but she had no drama. So that is a great example of what the steps can do, even when you're just starting. So it was really great to witness that in another person, because that is what I need to be convinced that there is a higher power. My own stuff, I think it's a coincidence, or I just was lucky one day, and I can really talk my higher power out of my own experience. But when I see it in other people, I'm really convinced. And we just reconnected with a wonderful lunch on Thursday, and it was so wonderful to hear how her story continued and how she rebuilt her life. When I met Lucy, she was dressed like a tomboy with all in black, those spiky boots, and she had this short blonde hair. And when I first saw her profile picture, I thought, who's that? Is that Lucy? I don't know a Lucy that looks like that. And I can tell you, she's still Lucy. She's still very bubbly and full of fun, but she's grown into a wonderful woman who is not only in recovery, but an inspiration to many people that are in her life. So.
Good afternoon, my name's Lucy and I'm an addict. Oh, it's so wonderful to be here. I don't know doing anything that brings terror and excitement and privilege as sharing at a convention, but it's so wonderful to be here today. And what an amazing introduction from Monica, who has been such an important person in my life. And I guess what I really want to do is I want to start off by saying thank you. I want to say thank you to the committee for putting on this amazing convention. Thank you for asking me to come here and share, which is just such a privilege. But the thing I really want to share and say thank you for is thank you to everybody who is speaking English when it is not your first language. So thank you so much for that. English is my first language, but I also speak a second language. So, I get it. So thank you to everyone that's speaking English at the convention. Yeah, how wonderful to be here. What I understand as well is that the people on the programming committee have never even been to a convention before. So, I mean, what you've put together is just fantastic. So thank you. So if I can start off with a bit of a cliche, a bit of a round of applause for everyone that's put on this convention. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. And just out of interest, I'm really curious, can anybody in the room that got clean during the pandemic, can you make yourselves known? How many people got clean? It's amazing. It's amazing. Welcome, welcome. You know, it's fantastic. So, I love cocaine, you know. That's why I'm here. You know, I love cocaine and I love Cocaine Anonymous. You know, both of them, funnily enough, kept me alive in a kind of weird way. So, you know, starting from the beginning, I was born into an alcoholic home, just full of dysfunction, but they were functioning alcoholics. So sometimes they did okay, and other times it was just completely bonkers. So there was also, my mother has an eating disorder, codependent, sex addiction, you know. They don't know that, however. They still to this day don't know that, but that's what I grew up with. My parents divorced when I was 5, and it was really messy. And the women in my life are very violent. So my first memory, when I was about 4 years old, is of my stepmother banging my head against a pavement to the point where I wet myself. And my mother was sort of present, looking on, and she did nothing. When I went to visit my father, who was obviously in a relationship with my stepmother, she would humiliate me. She was passive-aggressive. She obviously was not very happy about my sister and I going to spend time there. And there was another occasion when I was 7 when she put her hands around my neck to strangle me, and my father had to kind of pull her off. But nothing was ever discussed, nothing was ever spoken about. And then at home with my mother and my stepfather, it was just a lot of drinking. My mother was very aggressive, and she would normally go for my sister, my big sister, you know, pull hair, kick, spit would come out of her mouth. But again, like I said, sometimes we would do Sunday lunch and it would all be quiet and calm at home. So you just never knew what you were going to get. When I was 12 years old, and I guess this is quite an important part of my story, as a family, so my stepfather, my mother, my little brother and sister and I, we all moved to the island of Menorca in the Balearic Islands. And so I was 12 years old. It was back in the 80s. Now, back in the 80s, English girls had a bit of a reputation for going on holiday to Spain and getting drunk and having sex with waiters. And I hope they all had a lovely time. But when I was 12 years old, like this, I kind of got tarred with the same brush. So when I went to school, my sort of first weeks at school over in Menorca, I didn't speak the language. I looked completely different to my peers. I was obviously fair skin, fair hair. So I got bullied, but they used to call me a whore. They used to call me a puta at the age of 12, because I guess that's how they viewed English girls, which for me, who was just a little girl, was horrifying. I didn't know anything about sex. And to be called a whore was just, you know, one of the most hideous, you know, bullying names they could have chosen. It was horrible. You know, growing up in Spain in that time, you know, there were not that many English people living over there, so it was kind of tough. Today, I'm thrilled with the fact that I grew up in a different culture and I speak 2 languages, and I love going back to Menorca, but when I was in my teenage years, it was hard. But listen, I know I haven't cornered the market on bullying. I know a lot of us experience that when we're growing up. But I think for me, you know, the whole language barrier thing was tough. So anyway, so I started drinking when I was 12 years old and smoking dope. And I remember hearing a share when I came into CA. It was Earl H, actually, one of his shares. And he shared that when he took a drink or a hit, He was instantly happy doing what he was doing with the people he was doing it with. And that sums up my experience of drinking and using. So the first time I drank, there was a joint going around and there was a beer going around this table outside this nightclub. And I took a hit on both. And for the first time, I felt like I belonged. And it was wonderful. And it was like I could exhale. I think I was absolutely sick as a dog and embarrassed myself and threw up everywhere, and it was awful, and that was the end of that night. And you kind of would have thought that I'd never do it again, but this is where my love affair with drink and drugs started for the next 18 years. You know, my progression with drink and drugs is really uneventful. It's like everybody else's. You know, I started smoking dope, I was drinking beer, started taking pills. And when I was 18 years old, my stepfather bought me a one-way ticket back to London to go and find a career. And when I moved back to London, I discovered cocaine. So I was 18 years old when I found cocaine. Now, if my father was still alive today, my stepfather died about 10 years ago, but if he was still alive today, I'd have a conversation with him about the fact that you can't have it both ways, because he was really old-fashioned, and you don't educate girls. He didn't think you educated girls, but he sent me back to London to kind of go and find a job and a career. And what I know about us as addicts is that we are absolutely amazing at making things happen. So when I landed in England at 18 years old, I got a job straight away, and I got an apartment, and you know, I was really good at assembling things, but I wasn't very good at maintaining things. So I started out working as a receptionist at a recording studio. And it just so happened that I answered an ad in the newspaper, just really basic local newspaper, looking for a receptionist. And the recording studio is Olympic Studios in Barnes, and Olympic Studios was to the Rolling Stones what Abbey Road was to the Beatles. So I went to work at this really famous recording studio, and anybody, any big band at the time that was recording came into the studio. And you know, for me, I was a small town girl. You know, music had never really been important to me when I was growing up. So one of the things I had when I went to work in the music industry is that I wasn't really impressed by these bands. So it was a great job for me to have. And, you know, I traveled a lot. I toured Great Britain, Europe, Japan with people, because when I was working there, a singer that was pretty famous at the time came in, and I went to be her PA for a few years. So I was introduced to cocaine, and for me, you know, it's a bit like Bill when Bill talks about it in his story. You know, I had arrived, and the reason I love cocaine is because, for me, it gets me present. It gets me right here, right now. So when I use cocaine, I stop feeling sad about the past, and I stop worrying about tomorrow. Now, obviously, I understand that with the benefit of hindsight, but all I knew is that cocaine did for me what I couldn't do for myself. And I carried on using cocaine for the next, I guess, 12 years before I came into recovery. And I always joke, I stole this. I went to a convention when I was a couple of years clean, and the girl, the woman that was doing the shared that she went from the yacht to the squat with her using. And that was exactly my experience, you know. And I joke about it with Monaco. I had my handbag, hair and heels time when I was using, when it was all dinners out and a few lines after dinner, and that was all great. But then, you know, it descended into me using, you know, pretty much every day. And what happened was, when I was about 22, that music industry job dried up. But of course, I was going to all these parties and clubs and whatever. And in one of these nightclubs, there was this couple that were dealing coke, obviously. So I moved in with them in Brixton, in South London. And, you know, I'm kind of white, middle class. I speak the way I speak, I look the way I look. And they used me as a drug runner, basically. I mean, that's what I did. You know, they would give me a pouch of gear and a mobile phone and a driver. And I would go out around London dropping gear off for them. You know, that's what I did. Restaurants, nightclubs, Chelsea, Knightsbridge, whatever. And I fucking loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was amazing. You know, they kept me in gear, they kept me in cigarettes, you know, lobbed me money, you know, roof over my head. And I felt part of a family. I mean, how sad is that? That's when I first felt I had a family, when I was living with this family of drug dealers. And, you know, and I'm running gear for them. And listen, you know what? We've all got a war story, and I don't need to tell you, you know, the things I saw and experienced were just, you know, hideous in that time. You know, I had no fucking business being there at all. But the madness is I felt safe and I felt comfortable with them. While I was working for them, so I'm running these drugs, and a member of the family worked in a hostess club. So I went to the hostess club, and I thought, you know what, I can do that. So I started working in this hostess club, and I was kind of pulled to one side by one of the girls, and the girls basically said to me, you can make a bit more money if you go home with these guys. And that's what I started doing. And, you know, it's really interesting. It's not often that I go so deep and share about a lot of my past in my shares. As a woman today, I do have to protect my vulnerability. But I heard Martin earlier on sharing something that was personal to him, and I just thought, you know what, sometimes we might help somebody in the room, you know, with our experience. And so I became a sex worker. And I remember the first time I had sex for money. I left the hotel, and I was in a taxi heading back to Brixton, and I counted the money from one hand to another, and I thought about two things. One, I thought about those boys in the playground that used to call me a whore, and I thought, go on then. I am now. I mean, it's sick when I think back, but I just thought, come on then. And the second thing I thought about was all the times I'd done it for free, that I didn't really want to. You know, because rape isn't part of my story, but I went to a meeting a few years ago and I heard someone talk about consensual rape, and that blew my fucking mind. Because the amount of times I had sex with people that I didn't want to have sex with when I was using, you know, and that's another thing that I'm in recovery for today. So I went on to become a sex worker. You know what, when I was in London, it was all kind of the Savoy and the Ritz, and it was all high class, and I could dress it up. But after about a few months of doing that, you know, I kind of pissed the people off in the firm that I was working with, and they suggested it might be a good idea that I got out of London. And that's what I did. And I moved into a refuge in Hastings on the south coast for women that are victims of domestic violence. And I felt like a fraud being there, funnily enough. You know, there were some other girls there that I felt like deserved to be there more than I did, you know. But while I was in Hastings, I went to work in a house. And when you work in a house, you open the door and you get what you're given. You know, it's not the Ritz and the Savoy anymore. And I think the sick part was I didn't even need to do it. You know, it was just something that I did to feel part of. And I was talking about this earlier on as well. It was about power for me. Sex and money, it's all about power. Cocaine, you know, I'm so powerless. Where do I get my power? Well, sex, money for sex, and cocaine. It's a heady fucking combination that will keep you trapped. I started smoking crack, started smoking heroin when I was in Hastings. And you know what, again, I was talking about this with someone else. You know, when I'm smoking crack and heroin in the squat, I always felt like I didn't need to be there, like I could leave at any time. Like I even separated myself when I was using, you know. So I think I smoked crack and heroin and worked in this house for about 6 months, and I woke up one day and I thought, what the fuck are you doing? What the fuck are you doing here? And I got on a plane, I was 24, and I got on a plane and I went back to Menorca. So I arrived in Menorca, I go out, hit the bars, I scout out an old school friend of mine who's a dealer. Great, he becomes my boyfriend. Then I find out who he's buying from. I jogged him on, he became my boyfriend. You know, usual behaviour. And then I met an English man over there, and we got married. And what we did was we ran a club night over there. So we would spend the summers over there running this club night, and then we'd go back to Yorkshire in the winter. We did that for a few years. We just used the whole time. After a few years of being with him, I left that relationship. This is about a year and a half before I got clean. And, you know, like we talk about hitting bottom in recovery, but I'd just been dragging along the bottom for fucking years. And when I got clean, I think I had a couple of relationships with guys after my husband who did not use like me. Everybody else I've ever had a relationship with used like me, and that was great. But these two guys didn't. And I think the first couple of months they went out with me, they thought, oh, she's great, she's cool, isn't she? She's fun. And then after a couple of months, they'd go, oh, is this all you've got? This is it. And then they'd kind of, make other arrangements. But what it did was it started to instill some shame about my using. And I was doing that. I mean, I was a full-blown cocaine addict trying to hide my using. The old put a line out, flush the loo, run the tap, snort it, that whole thing. And but it just sort of planted a seed. And when I got clean, I think a couple of weeks before I got clean, it was, the planets were all lining up. All I did was use for 4 or 5 days, pass out, use for 4 or 5 days, pass out. Nobody wanted to hang out with me, literally no one. My phone only rang if anyone wanted to score gear, because I obviously put the fact that I was bilingual to good use and was selling cocaine to English people. I was skimming off them, just really shit behaviour, it was pathetic. And I think one of the things that happened is I knew that I had a hole in my nose, and I kind of blew my nose, and my nose kind of fell in my hand. And do you know what? Looking back, I realised that it sounds awful, but I'm so grateful that happened, because in that moment, I knew that I had done it to myself. Like, I could blame everybody else for everything else, but the nose thing, that was me. I put the cocaine up my nose. And so, it's all just a bit shit. And I put my hands up and said, I can't do this. So it's 2005, and I'm living on the island of Menorca. Now, Menorca's a small island in the Mediterranean. For those who don't know, it's like 22 kilometres wide by 45 kilometres long. It's tiny. Population's about 100,000 in the winter. And so we had UK television. And we'd seen the adverts, Talk to Frank, which was an ad campaign that they'd done in the UK for people that were struggling with drugs. And there was a telephone number. So I called the telephone number, and it happened to be the helpline for Cocaine Anonymous in London. Now, I didn't know anything about anything, didn't know anything about the fellowships. And it was the 20th of August, 2005. It was a Saturday afternoon. And the guy that answered the phone is a man called Ian W., and he was doing service that day. And for me, this is kind of where, like we talk about the miracles, and this is where the miracles really started for me. So the guy that's doing service in London on that day, Ian, picks up the phone, and I'm like, listen, my name's Lucy, I'm 30 years old, I live on the island of Menorca, I think I've got a problem with cocaine. And he said to me, okay, my sponsor Paul lives on the island of Mallorca, which is the island next door. So I was like, okay, amazing. So Paul rang me. Paul called me. This booming Scottish voice comes down the phone. And he did that thing that we do where he shared a bit about his story. I didn't have a clue what he was doing. And he was talking. And his sponsor at the time was Danny F., who is a former New York gangster. So I heard New York gangster, and I thought, I'm in. These are my people. That's amazing. These are my people. So fortunately for me, Paul was doing a lot of service at the time. Obviously, CA in the UK was really small back then. And he was going to area. And the reason I say that is because he was armed with the facts about the online area of Cocaine Anonymous. Because we worked out there were no meetings on Menorca. None of the fellowships were represented, either in English or in Spanish. I'd have gone anywhere, quite frankly. So he 12-stepped me into the online area of Cocaine Anonymous. Now, not to minimize anybody's experience who got clean in the pandemic, when I say online, I mean email. I don't mean videos or calls or any, it was an email forum. And what you would do is you would write subscribe in the subject line, send an email out, I joined Sisters in Sobriety, and then you were a member of the list, basically. So if anybody sent an email to Sisters in Sobriety, you got the email. And that's how I joined Cocaine Anonymous. And again, I wrote in Lucy, 30, Menorca. And what I got was an outpouring of love from women all over the world. I found it so attractive, and I'm talking emails coming into my, through my, I borrowed someone's laptop, I didn't have a computer. But it was so attractive, and these were women that were all over the world. There were loners like me. There was Alex in Germany, there was Marty in the Caribbean. There was, Monica was here she was in Den Haag, Karen in Amsterdam. And then there were some amazing women in the UK and the United States who had access to face-to-face meetings. Makes me feel emotional when I think about it. But they were coming online to carry the message to women like me who were coming in alone. And this meeting was amazing. They are the biggest cross-talking meetings of Cocaine Anonymous in the world. And people would just put out their little shares and people would share back. There were service commitments, there were readings that were posted. And what these women did is they engaged me. And they suggested everything that we suggest to people that go to a face-to-face meeting. Keep coming back, the 1990, I know we've nicked that from another fellowship, but, keep coming to meetings. And it was suggested that I get a sponsor. So I applied for a list of women willing to be a sponsor online. And Monica's was the only name in Europe, and that's what I chose. The other women were in America, and I figured that we were on the same time frame. So I wrote an email very polite, I think, email to Monica. Would you mind, ever so be lovely if, would you be my sponsor? And I'm a cocaine addict, but I'm polite. And she wrote back this lovely email, and I remember one of the questions was I willing to go to any lengths? And you know what? I didn't know what that meant, but all the cliches about my early recovery are true. That gift of desperation. I'd have done anything. It was my using was shit in the end. And I just said yes, I was. And Monica asked me to pray in the morning and ask for a sober day. Now, I'm a cocaine addict, so I thought I was cool as fuck. And people that were cool as fuck didn't pray. But I thought I'd give it a go anyway. And I kind of I got the spiritual element of it, and I just thought, oh, go on then, I didn't have anywhere else to go. But if I'm honest, I had that deep down fundamental idea of God. It was just really hidden by, me. So I was asked to pray in the morning and ask for a sober day. And what Monica did was she would email me chapters of the big book with questions. And I was to read the paragraph or the paragraphs, and then there would be a question, and I was to answer the question, relating my experience to whatever it was that I had read. And what she asked me to do was 10 minutes a day was too little, and 2 hours a day was too much. And I was to work on the questions somewhere in between. And that's what I did. Monica also got me into a 10th step, very quickly. I was to write every day, how my day had gone. And in the evening, if I'd had a sober day, I was to thank God. And that's what I did. And we went through the book page by page, paragraph by paragraph, by email. No phone calls. I think we spoke to each other once when I first came in, and that was it. I didn't have money to make international calls. Again, there was no, WhatsApp or, I don't think iPhones had been invented then. So it was literally all done by email. And the thing that really, I guess, lands in my heart today is that every email I wrote, Monica responded to. Every email, I got a response. And I worked out very quickly, if I don't write to Monica, she's not going to write to me. And I worked that out. She had what I wanted, and I had to go and get it. And I kind of had, I went through the book, as outlined, you know, the program that is outlined in that book, went to meetings, I got service in Sisters in Sobriety, I posted reaching out on a Thursday, and I had a spiritual experience of the educational variety that it talks about. I mean, it's really not, that's what I got. I went through the work, found God, that's it, you know. I joined Hope, Faith and Courage, which is a mixed meeting of CA when I was 60 days clean. And, you know, that's when I met Nick and, you know, some wonderful people were in those online meetings because most people were just there to be of service. So it was suggested that I start a meeting of Cocaine Anonymous on Menorca. I think, 60 days clean, something like that. So I applied to Los Angeles to the World Service to get a starter pack, and it turned up. And it was just beautiful, this thing that turned up. It was lovely, big CA on it, and chips and literature. Because I'd never been to a meeting before. So I didn't really know what to do, so I kind of shelved it. I got a room to use, you know, didn't know what to do with it. When I was about 4 months clean, and again, this is something else that lands in my soul today, you know, at the time it was just like, oh, great. Monica emailed and said, okay, you've written step 4, I will come to Menorca to listen to your step 5. So this person I'd never met before took 2 aeroplanes at her own expense, flew from Schiphol to Barcelona, changed planes into Menorca, and arrived on the 6th of January 2006. And we opened Cocaine Anonymous Menorca the next day. And she showed me how to have a meeting. And yeah, you know, that woman showed me how important my step work was. You know, she'd take 2 aeroplanes to come and listen to me, and how important it was. What Monica also did was she drummed service into me, because I think living on a tiny island, if I hadn't have done service, I wouldn't be here now, you know. Because we opened CA Menorca and no one came. No one came for about 6-9 months. And I'd go every Thursday and I'd put the books out and the literature out and the chips out, and no one came. And I'd come back and I'd write online, no one came. And like Bob in Tucson would go, because he was my home group, you know, Bob in Tucson would go, give it 2 years, mate. No one comes in 2 years, you can close it. I'm like, all right, Bob, give it 2 years. And then in the end, I didn't know what I was more afraid of, you know, no one coming or someone actually showing up, you know. Then what do you do? But people came and it was amazing. And my telephone number was on CA websites, and people would call me in January and say, I'm booking my holiday to Menorca in July. And I'd be like, yes, someone's coming in July, brilliant. And it was great. And we had this little room, but, you know, we didn't have any money to keep it up. So the meeting I had them in my home and on beaches and round at people's houses, and it was brilliant. And I would spot these people. I'd meet them in the main square near where I lived, and I can spot an addict at like 20 paces, you know, and people are like fucking up. They're on holiday with their families, desperate for a meeting, you know. They were just so grateful to see me, like, yeah, you know, and I was so grateful to see them. And then I come back to the UK, I go back to the UK to conventions, and I just plug in, and it was just amazing. And, you know, if anyone hasn't been to a sobriety countdown, be here tomorrow, because they're fucking epic, you know. And that's what I did, you know. And I mean, CA Menorca was my bread and butter. I held every service position in CA Menorca for about 5 years. You know, Nick came over with his partner Melody, and people were wonderful. People would turn up and they'd be like, oh, you're on your own. And then they'd come back and they'd bring their prayer books or their reading books, and they'd leave them with me. And somebody would come back on holiday, they'd bring the scrolls in their suitcase. You know, people just turn up with gifts for this little CA Menorca. It was just wonderful. And I met some wonderful people, and we had 3 conventions. First year, there were 3 of us. The second year, there were 5 of us, and the last year, there were 14 of us. And Peter O flew over from Hong Kong to do the main chair. It was the CA Menorca Rocks 3. It was brilliant. And yeah, it was absolutely fantastic to be introduced to the fellowship in that way. And yeah, like I said, if I hadn't done service, I wouldn't be here. So what have I been doing for the last 17 years? So I've been growing up. That's what I've been doing. I've nicked this from another fellowship. It's in their step 1, and they talk about recovery does not equal social acceptability, and that's what I wanted when I got clean, because I'm a really capable person. I'm really bright. I'm a really capable person, but my will was still kind of going over there. And what I thought was house, partner, job, car, dog. It's all like trying. There's an expression in English, it's like nailing jelly to a wall. It just doesn't fucking work, And I did a lot of that in early recovery. If I could just make it look all right from the outside, it would be all right. And it just fucking wasn't, The job went and the house went, the partner went, still had the dog. But, and I was really arrogant because I was, God's taken all of these things from me. No, I gave them all away. You know what I mean? I didn't know. It's just, that's me all over. I know how to get it. It's a bit shit at keeping it, And I moved back to England when I was 5 years clean, because the on your own thing makes a half decent story, but the reality of it is I kind of knew that if I didn't come back to a place where people looked me in the eye on the regular, I was probably going to pick up at some stage, So I came back to the UK, and I am that woman who went from one relationship to another, hoping that I was going to find the answer. That is my direct experience. And then when I stopped doing that, I am that person that kept going back to the toxic relationship, hoping I was going to fucking make it better. I am that person. When I was 7, I did nothing but CA for the first 7 years of my recovery. And when I was about 7 years clean, I started to be, this is my truth and my story, and I know not everyone has the same, and thanks for listening to my story. Mine is that I needed to go to some other places in order to remain sober. So it was suggested that I go to some other fellowships and I have a look at my relationship with sex. It was suggested that I go to some other relationships and have a look at my relationship with food. It was suggested that I go and go to another fellowship to look at the relationship with my familial relationships. And it was suggested that I get some outside help. And I've taken every single one of these suggestions, and I really needed to, because I got to a point where, I've got 25 sponsees, I'm sponsored, I'm taking reams of inventory, and I want to fucking kill myself. That's where I got to at 7-8 years clean. My stepfather died. The house of cards just fucking crumbled. And I'm so grateful that this has been my experience, because in Cocaine Anonymous, I found God. But in some of those other fellowships, I found me. And that's my truth. I went back to school. I went back to college when I was 8 years sober, because I've always winged it. Remember, I was that woman without an education, and I'm really bright. And I went back to college, and I got a degree. I trained professionally, which was so esteeming for me. It was interesting hearing the workshop earlier on about dual diagnosis. When I was about 10 years clean, I had a nervous breakdown of sorts. And when I was turning 10, I loved it. Like the 6 months before I turned 10, I started to take the credit back. Forgot God, edged God out, one of those. I'm sitting in the back row of CA meetings. Every share I shared, I'm going to be 10 in a minute. I'm 10 in 6 months. I'm 10 in 3 months. I'm 10 in a minute. And then when I turned 10, I was just 10, I'm 10. And what I thought was going to happen when I turned 10 was that I was going to turn up at meetings and I was going to get taken off into a side room with all the other people that were double digits, and we'd all have cups and saucers, silver-plated big books, recliners. What I got was an anxiety disorder and a tea commitment at 10. Them's the breaks. But I'm so grateful for that, because for me, my relationship with anxiety just made me more devotional. I think it's really important to say that anxiety is not the spiritual malady. There are certain co-occurring illnesses that we need to go and get outside help for. But it did make me a lot more devotional to the program, to service, and I'm so grateful for that, because I felt like I went back to the beginning again. So, where am I today? Well, I'm single, which I adore. My journey for me, has been to this point of being, it's such a cliche, but you know what, it was so painful to have a relationship with me. I didn't fucking want it at all. I really wanted a relationship with somebody else, and then I could just not look at me, and God had another plan. And how I feel is that for years in recovery, I simultaneously ran away and towards this relationship with myself. And eventually I surrendered to it. I bought my own home last year, which is just an absolute fucking miracle for me, on my own, to own my own home. I put my focus on work. I was double promoted at work last year. I'm the lead member of staff at the treatment centre that I work for. Excuse me. I think God's telling me to shut up. You know, I'm sponsored. You know, I'm sponsoring women. And, you know, I spoke to my sponsor. I see my sponsor every Monday for an hour on video call. She's in California. And, you know, I'm going to finish on this. And she said to me, you know what, Lucy? You've done all the hard work. It's time for the adventure. And you know what? I'm only 16 and a bit years clean. That's what I know. I can't wait to find out what's coming next. And I can't wait to find out what's coming next with all of you. So thanks for letting me share.